In a quiet town where nothing ever seems out of place, Officer Marcus Reed begins his night shift, expecting the usual routine traffic stops, calm streets, and the comforting hum of his patrol car. But a simple stop at a quiet intersection changes everything. A middle-aged man behind the wheel, polite but too polished. A young girl in the back seat, clutching her stuffed bear with a grip far too tight. Her whispered plea, two small, almost imperceptible words, shatters the illusion of normalcy. Help me. What should have been a routine stop becomes a race against time, plunging Marcus into a dark, twisted conspiracy that runs deeper than he ever imagined. As he fights to unravel the truth, every second counts. His instincts will be tested, his courage pushed to the limit, and the fate of innocent children will hang in the balance. Who is the man behind the wheel, and what is he hiding? Can Marcus and his partner Claire outsmart a network of predators before it's too late? And will the silent plea of a terrified child lead to a story of justice or heartbreak? Join us as we follow Marcus on a journey of resilience, courage, and hope, a reminder that even the smallest cry for help can spark an unstoppable fight for justice. The hum of the patrol car's engine was a familiar sound to Officer Marcus Reed as he drove down the quiet suburban streets. The late autumn air was crisp, and the sky above had begun to darken into deep shades of purple and blue. The clock on his dashboard read 8:45 p.m. It had been an uneventful shift so far, just the way Marcus preferred it. He was accustomed to slow nights in this part of town, clean sidewalks, tidy homes, and families safe behind locked doors. But Marcus also knew that calm could be deceiving. The streets ahead were empty, lined with trees shedding the last of their golden leaves. As he approached the intersection, something caught his eye. A worn gray sedan rolled through the stop sign without so much as slowing down. Marcus sighed and flicked on his patrol lights. A stop sign was a stop sign, no matter how quiet the night seemed. The sedan coasted to the side of the road and stopped. Marcus parked behind it and took a moment to observe. The driver was a middle-aged man wearing a neatly pressed button-down shirt. His posture was composed, too composed. Marcus grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I'm conducting a routine traffic stop on a gray sedan. License plate 7D4K, 821. No backup needed." He stepped out of his cruiser and adjusted his belt as the cool breeze brushed his face. Marcus approached the driver's window, his senses sharp, despite the routine nature of the stop. The window rolled down with a smooth hum. The man behind the wheel greeted him with a polite, rehearsed smile. "Good evening, officer. Is something wrong?" "You rolled through the stop sign back there," Marcus replied calmly. "Any reason for the rush?" The man chuckled softly. "Just trying to get home. Long day at work. No excuse, I know." "License and registration, please," Marcus requested. The man reached for the glove compartment without hesitation and pulled out the requested documents. "Name's John Miller," he said smoothly. "And this is my daughter, Lila." Marcus glanced into the back seat. A little girl sat with a small stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. She looked no older than 7, with soft brown curls framing her pale face. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, but her small shoulders were hunched as though she were trying to make herself as small as possible. Marcus felt a strange weight in his chest as he studied her. The little girl's eyes met his for a brief moment before she quickly looked away. She offered a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a child's face, forced, fragile, and hollow. "Evening, Lila," Marcus said gently. "You okay back there?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. John smiled again, quick and practiced. "She's just tired. Long family dinner. You know how it is." Marcus nodded, but something in his gut twisted. He looked down at the documents. Everything appeared legitimate. The car was registered to John Miller, and the address matched the ID. But as Marcus handed back the papers, he noticed something When John rested his hand on Lila's shoulder, she flinched, just barely, but enough for Marcus to catch it. "All right, Mr. Miller," Marcus said after a pause. "Make sure you come to a full stop at signs. It's for everyone's safety." "Of course, officer," John replied, his voice light. "Have a good night." The gray sedan pulled away, its taillights glowing like distant embers as it disappeared around the corner. Marcus stood by his cruiser, watching until the night swallowed the car whole. He felt a strange, restless tension in his chest, something that told him he had just missed something important. He slid back into his seat, closed the door, and exhaled slowly. The street was quiet again, but Marcus's thoughts were loud. He reached for his notebook and jotted down the plate number. The silence returned, but the unease did not fade. Marcus stared at the empty street ahead, knowing one thing for certain: his instincts had never failed him before. And tonight, they were telling him that something was wrong. He did not know it yet, but the decision to trust his instincts would change everything. The precinct was quiet when Marcus Reed walked in, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights overhead barely registering in his mind. It was close to 9:30 p.m., and most of the night shift was either out on patrol or buried in paperwork. Marcus dropped his hat on his desk and sank into his chair, but his thoughts were far from the reports piled in front of him. The image of the girl in the back seat haunted him, the way she clutched that stuffed bear like it was the only thing holding her together. The way her faint smile had trembled and faded too quickly. Marcus rubbed his temples, trying to shake the unease that gripped him. He pulled out his notebook and stared at the license plate he had written down. 7D4K 821. The numbers seemed to blur as he stared, replaying the encounter in his mind, the man's calm voice, too smooth for the circumstances. The girl's silence. Without another thought, Marcus turned on his computer and typed the plate number into the state database. His fingers moved automatically, his instincts pushing him forward even as his logic told him that it was probably nothing. The search results appeared within seconds. The vehicle was registered to John Miller, residing at an address on West Pine Avenue, just outside town. No prior arrests, no citations. On paper, John Miller was an upstanding citizen, but Marcus had seen too many cases where the truth didn't live on paper. He leaned forward and clicked to pull up the dashcam footage from his patrol car. The grainy video filled his screen, and he fast-forwarded until he reached the moment he had spoken to the girl. He paused the video and zoomed in on her face. Her wide eyes stared straight ahead, darting nervously every few seconds. Marcus hit play again, watching closely. He felt the breath catch in his throat as he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Her lips moved. He rewound the video and slowed it down. This time, he caught it, two faint words, barely there but unmistakable. "Help me." Marcus sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran a hand over his face and stared at the screen. She wasn't just shy or tired. She was terrified. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen detective Claire Monroe. He grabbed the phone and answered. "Claire." Her familiar voice came through, sharp but calm. "Hey, Marcus, what's up? You sound off." Marcus hesitated, his eyes still locked on the frozen image of the girl's face. "I need you to come down to the precinct. There's something you need to see." There was a pause on the other end, then Claire's no-nonsense tone kicked in. "Be there in 10. Marcus barely noticed the time pass as he waited. He replayed the footage over and over, searching for any detail he might have missed. The girl's body language, the way her hands clenched around the stuffed bear, it all painted the same picture. When Claire walked into the room, her coat slung over one arm, Marcus motioned her over without looking away from the screen. "Take a look at this," he said, rewinding the footage and hitting play. Claire leaned in, her sharp eyes narrowing as she watched. They sat in silence as the scene played out, the stop, the smooth answers, and finally, the girl's whisper. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not just a tired kid," Claire muttered, straightening. "That's a plea." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I ran the plates. The guy checks out clean record, solid address, but something about him isn't right." Claire crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "We need to check for active missing persons reports. If she's not his daughter—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus knew exactly what she meant. He nodded and pulled up the National Missing Children database. Claire pulled a chair beside him, both of them tense as the screen loaded. The database's search bar blinked, waiting. Marcus hesitated for only a second before typing in the description: female, age 6 to 8, dark hair, last seen within the last 7 days. The results appeared within seconds, and Marcus's heart sank as he scrolled. Halfway down the list, one report made his breath catch. Lucy Harper, age 7, reported missing 3 days ago from her family's home in Ridgefield, about 50 miles away. Last seen playing in her front yard. Claire leaned in closer, reading the details. Brown hair, blue eyes, stuffed bear. "It's her," Marcus said, his voice rough. The screen displayed Lucy's photo, a bright-eyed, happy girl grinning as she held her stuffed bear. The contrast between that image and the pale, trembling child he had seen tonight felt like a punch to the gut. Claire exhaled slowly, her expression hardening. "We've got an abductor on the loose." Marcus reached for his jacket and grabbed his keys. "We've got to move now. If he's on the run, we don't have much time." Claire was already pulling out her phone to notify dispatch. "I'll request backup and put out an alert to every unit in the area." Marcus's pulse thrummed in his ears as they hurried toward the exit. The air outside was colder now, biting against his skin, but he barely noticed. "West Pine Avenue," Marcus muttered as he climbed into his cruiser. "If that's his home, maybe he's headed back there." Claire pulled up beside him in her unmarked car. "If he's smart, he won't go anywhere predictable, but it's a place to start." Marcus nodded, gripping the wheel. "Let's find her." As they sped toward the address, Marcus felt a fierce resolve settle over him. He had let that car drive away once, but not again. Somewhere out there, Lucy Harper was waiting for someone to listen to her silent plea, and Marcus Reed wasn't about to let her down. The streetlights blurred as Marcus Reed's cruiser sped through the quiet town, his pulse quickening with every mile. His thoughts raced as fast as the scenery outside his window. Claire's car was just ahead, her taillights glowing like distant beacons. Lucy Harper, missing for 3 days. Marcus had read about her case when it first broke her parents' frantic press conference, their tearful pleas for her safe return. Now that plea had come straight from Lucy's own lips, though faint and fleeting. "Help me." Claire's voice crackled over the radio. "We're 5 minutes out from West Pine Avenue. What's the play, Marcus?" Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind working through the possibilities. "We approach calm. If he sees us coming and panics, he could do something reckless. We need him to feel in control until we get Lucy out of there." "Got it," Claire responded. There was a pause before she added, "Marcus, if she's really in there." "She is," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "It's her. I know it." Claire didn't argue. They had been partners long enough for her to trust his instincts, and Marcus's instincts had never been sharper. The street was eerily quiet when they arrived at West Pine Avenue. The houses were spaced apart, their porches lit with warm, golden light. Everything about the neighborhood seemed ordinary, safe. Marcus pulled his cruiser to the curb a few houses down from John Miller's address. Claire parked beside him and got out, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. Marcus adjusted his radio and holstered his flashlight as they approached the house together. The property was unremarkable, small and tidy, with a cracked walkway leading to the front porch. The windows were covered with thin curtains, and a dim light glowed behind them. The house felt still, too still. Claire motioned toward the side of the house. "Let's cover the exits." Marcus nodded, stepping onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under his boots as he raised his fist and knocked. "Mr. Miller," Marcus called, keeping his voice calm but firm. "This is the police. We need to speak with you." No answer. Claire moved to the back corner of the house, scanning for any movement. Marcus knocked again, harder this time. "John Miller, open the door. We know you're in there." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a sudden clatter from the back of the house. Marcus's muscles tensed. "He's running!" Claire's voice came from around the side. Marcus bolted off the porch, sprinting toward the backyard just in time to see a figure leap over the fence, a blur of motion in the dark. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, vaulting the fence with Claire right behind him. The figure didn't stop. He crashed through the underbrush toward the woods at the edge of the property, his breaths ragged and loud in the cold night air. Claire veered left, circling around to cut him off. "Stay on him," she called. Marcus's flashlight beam bounced wildly as he ran, his feet pounding against the ground. Branches scraped at his arms, but he pushed forward, fueled by adrenaline. He could hear John Miller's frantic breathing just ahead. Suddenly, the woods opened up into a clearing. In the center stood an old utility shed, its wooden frame weathered and sagging. Miller stumbled toward it, throwing open the door. Marcus surged forward, his voice cutting through the night. "Miller, it's over!" John turned, his face pale and wild in the moonlight. His chest heaved with exertion, but there was something else in his eyes' desperation. "You don't understand," John shouted, holding his arms out defensively. "She needed me. She was alone." Marcus slowed, his flashlight casting long shadows across the clearing. "You took her from her family," he said, his voice steady but cold. "She's not yours to save." John's expression twisted with anger. "They don't care about her," he spat. "They left her, she was all alone." Before Marcus could respond, Claire burst through the trees, her gun drawn, but lowered. "John Miller, step away from the shed. Hands where we can see them." Miller froze, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Marcus took a step forward. "She's just a little girl. You're not helping her by doing this." Miller's face crumpled for a moment, but then his gaze hardened. "I was protecting her," he whispered. Claire moved swiftly, closing the distance between them. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Miller's wrist and twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. Marcus moved past them, his focus locked on the shed. The door hung half open, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. His heart pounded as he reached for the handle. "Lucy?" Marcus called, his voice softening. "It's okay. You're safe now. I'm here to take you home." There was no response at first, only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. Then, from the shadows, came the faintest sound, a sniffle. Marcus stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping the small space. In the corner, huddled on the floor, was Lucy Harper. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and her stuffed bear was clutched to her chest. Marcus crouched down, his voice gentle. "Lucy, I'm Officer Reed. You're safe now." Her wide eyes met his, filled with fear and uncertainty. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the sleeve of his jacket. "It's okay," Marcus whispered. "No one is going to hurt you." Lucy nodded, just a small, tentative movement, and allowed Marcus to lift her into his arms. Her small body trembled, but she clung to him tightly. Claire appeared at the door, her gaze softening when she saw Lucy. "She's okay?" Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She's okay." As they walked out of the shed and back into the clearing, Marcus felt Lucy's grip tighten around his neck. He glanced back at Claire, who led the way toward the waiting squad cars. The night was cold, but Marcus barely noticed. He could feel Lucy's heartbeat against his chest, steady but fragile. For the first time that night, a small sense of relief settled over him. Lucy Harper was safe, but this was only the beginning. The air outside was sharp and cold as Marcus carried Lucy Harper toward the waiting squad cars at the edge of the clearing. Claire walked ahead, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as they reached the main road where the backup units had parked. The blue and red lights painted the trees in waves of color. Paramedics were waiting by the nearest ambulance, their faces grim but focused. Lucy's tiny frame was still trembling as she clung to Marcus, her head resting against his shoulder. "It's okay," Marcus whispered as he reached the ambulance. "They're here to help you." Lucy hesitated but loosened her grip, allowing the paramedics to gently wrap a blanket around her. She looked at Marcus with wide eyes, unsure but trusting. "I'll be right here," Marcus reassured her. Lucy nodded slowly as one of the paramedics began checking her vitals. Marcus stepped back, but stayed close, folding his arms as he watched. His heart was still pounding in his chest. Claire joined him, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "She's going to be okay," she said quietly. "But we're not done." Marcus's gaze shifted to the back of the patrol car, where John Miller sat, handcuffed and staring straight ahead. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "He's hiding something," Marcus muttered. "There's more to this than what we've seen." Claire followed his gaze. "We'll find out soon enough. Let's get him back to the precinct." Marcus nodded, though his jaw remained tight. Every second mattered. If Miller was part of something bigger, if Lucy wasn't the first child, the thought made Marcus's stomach twist. The ride back to the precinct was tense and quiet. Marcus kept glancing in the rearview mirror at John Miller, whose face remained calm, almost eerily so. Claire followed closely in her unmarked car. Lucy had been taken to the nearest hospital to be checked out, and social workers were already en route. But Marcus's mind was still racing. The questions burned in his chest. At the precinct, Marcus and Claire pulled into the back lot. Marcus climbed out first, yanking open the rear door. Miller didn't resist, as Marcus hauled him to his feet. The night air was bitter, but Miller's face was blank, void of remorse or fear. Marcus clenched his jaw as they walked through the side entrance and into the station. "Interrogation room 3, Claire instructed. Marcus led Miller down the hall and into the small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare except for a camera mounted in the corner, its small red light glowing steadily. Miller sat down without being asked, resting his cuffed hands on the table. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes' defiance. Claire closed the door behind them and took the seat across from Miller, folding her hands in front of her. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his stare hard. Claire spoke first, her tone cold but composed. "We found Lucy Harper in that shed, a 7-year-old girl who's been missing for 3 days. Do you want to explain why she was with you?" Miller's lips pressed into a thin line before he leaned back in his chair. "She wasn't safe where she was." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You took her from her family. That's not protecting her, it's kidnapping." Miller's eyes flickered. "Her family didn't care. She was alone." Marcus stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "And you decided you had the right to take her? Do you have any idea what her parents have been through? What Lucy has been through?" Miller's calm cracked for the briefest moment, a flash of anger passing over his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "No one ever cared about me. No one ever came for me when I needed help." Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. "Whatever happened to you doesn't justify what you've done. Lucy's not yours to save." Miller's hands tightened into fists on the table. "You think you're heroes, don't you? You don't know how broken this world is. Kids like her, they slip through the cracks. I was just—" He trailed off, his breath unsteadies. Marcus's stomach twisted. Despite everything, he could see that Miller believed what he was saying. But belief didn't make it right. It made it dangerous. Claire leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just about Lucy, is it?" Miller's eyes darted toward her, but he said nothing. Marcus took another step closer. How many other kids, John? Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Claire's gaze didn't waver. We've got you, John. We've got Lucy's testimony, the dashcam footage, and the fact that you ran. This is the part where you can help yourself, or dig a deeper hole. For a moment, Miller's mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, and he looked older, more worn. But then he shook his head slowly. I was only trying to do what someone should have done for me, he whispered. Claire exchanged a glance with Marcus, her jaw tight. They had what they needed to charge him, but it wasn't enough. Not for the bigger picture. After Miller was processed and secured in a holding cell, Marcus and Claire stepped into the observation room, watching the footage of the interrogation replay on the screen. Claire ran a hand through her hair, exhaling slowly. He's hiding something. I don't know if it's guilt or something worse. Marcus nodded, his eyes still locked on the screen. We need to dig deeper, talk to Lucy once she's stable. If she knows anything about where he was taking her, or if there are others. Claire rested a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out. But first, you need to take a breath. You've been running on adrenaline since the moment you pulled that car over. Marcus sighed, the tension in his chest easing only slightly. I just keep thinking, what if I hadn't stopped him? What if I had let him drive away? But you didn't, Claire said firmly. Lucy's safe because of you. Marcus nodded, though the weight in his chest remained. Claire was right. Lucy was safe. But they both knew this case wasn't over. If John Miller had taken Lucy to protect her, what other cracks in his story hadn't they seen yet? Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and felt his pulse quicken. A message from the hospital. Lucy's awake. Claire raised an eyebrow at his expression. Marcus tucked the phone away, his voice steady but urgent. Let's go. We need to hear her side. As they left the observation room, Marcus felt the weight of the night settle deeper in his bones. But beneath that weight, there was something else, a quiet determination. Lucy's story wasn't over, and neither was their search for the truth. The hospital lobby was quiet, except for the soft hum of machines and the murmur of voices from distant rooms. Marcus Reed walked with quick, determined strides, Claire close behind him. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow, but Marcus barely noticed. His focus was locked on the room ahead, the one where Lucy Harper was waiting. A nurse at the front desk greeted them with a nod. She's in room 214. A child psychologist is with her now. She's alert, but still shaken. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. As they reached the door, Marcus paused and took a deep breath. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember, we're here to listen. Let her talk at her own pace. Marcus nodded, then gently pushed open the door. Lucy was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Her dark curls framed her pale face, and her stuffed bear was tucked tightly under her arm. A woman in a gray blazer sat beside her, speaking in a calm, soothing tone. When Lucy saw Marcus, her eyes widened with recognition. She didn't look afraid, only relieved. Hi, Lucy, Marcus said softly, crouching down to her eye level. Do you remember me? Lucy nodded slowly. You're Officer Reed. That's right, Marcus said, offering her a reassuring smile. I told you I'd be here. Lucy's fingers fidgeted with the bear's frayed ear. Are you here to take me home? Marcus's heart tightened at the question. He glanced at Claire, who stepped forward. Lucy, Claire began gently, we need your help. We know this is hard, but can you tell us what happened? How you ended up with John? Lucy's small shoulders rose and fell as she took a shaky breath. The psychologist gave her an encouraging nod. It's okay, Marcus added. We're here to make sure you're safe. Lucy's voice was soft but steady. I was playing in the front yard with my bear. Mommy was inside making lunch. She paused, her eyes darting downward. Then he came. Claire leaned in slightly. John Miller? Lucy nodded, tightening her grip on the bear. He said I looked sad. He said he knew a place where I'd be safe. She swallowed hard. I didn't want to go, but he grabbed my arm. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. And he took you to that shed? Lucy shook her head. No, we went to other places first. I don't remember their names. But he kept saying I'd be safe soon. Tears welled in her eyes. He lied. Claire stepped closer, her tone gentle. Lucy, did you see anyone else? Was John alone? Lucy hesitated, then nodded. There was a man. I never saw his face. He stayed outside when we stopped at the shed. Marcus and Claire exchanged a tense glance. Lucy, Claire asked carefully, do you remember what he looked like? Anything at all? Lucy's brow furrowed in concentration. He wore a hoodie. I think it was dark blue. He didn't talk much, but I heard John call him Matt. Marcus felt the pieces click into place. Matt, he repeated quietly. Claire straightened. Matthew Carson. He's been questioned in other missing persons cases but never charged. He fits the profile, always working in the shadows. Lucy's breathing quickened, her voice trembling. Are they going to come back for me? Marcus's voice was firm but kind. No, Lucy. They'll never hurt you again. We promise. Lucy stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, the smallest hint of trust returning to her eyes. Outside the room, Marcus and Claire regrouped by the elevators. Claire's expression was tight with focus. Matthew Carson, she muttered. We need to put out an alert. Marcus nodded. We need to move fast. If Carson is involved, this isn't over. Claire was already dialing dispatch. Detective Monroe requesting an APB on Matthew Carson, possible accomplice in the Harper abduction. Suspect is mid-30s, dark hair, often wears a hoodie. Known to frequent motels and isolated properties. Marcus leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. It's not just Lucy. If Miller and Carson are working together, they've done this before. Claire nodded grimly. And there could be more kids out there. Within the hour, they were back in their cars, heading toward the precinct. The radio crackled with updates from nearby units as the search for Carson intensified. As they pulled into the parking lot, a uniformed officer jogged over to meet them. Detectives, the officer panted, we got a tip from a diner waitress south of town. A man matching Carson's description was seen earlier tonight. He was with someone who looked nervous, a little girl. She dropped a stuffed bear, and he snapped at her before dragging her to the car. Marcus felt a wave of anger flare in his chest. What's the address? The officer handed him a slip of paper. It's a roadside diner off Highway 9, about 10 miles south. Claire's eyes narrowed. He's still in the area. Marcus didn't hesitate. He climbed back into his cruiser, the engine roaring to life. Claire followed close behind. The highway stretched ahead of them, dark and nearly empty. Marcus's headlights cut through the night as he pushed the speed limit, the weight of the new lead pressing down on him. Stay sharp, Claire said over the radio. If Carson spooked, he could run. I know, Marcus replied, his voice steady but tense. Minutes later, the flickering neon sign of the roadside diner came into view. Marcus pulled into the gravel lot and parked near the entrance. Only a few cars were scattered across the lot, none of them matching the description of Miller's sedan or Carson's usual vehicle. Claire's unmarked car pulled in beside him. They exchanged a look before stepping out into the cold night air. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as they entered. A middle-aged waitress with tired eyes glanced up from behind the counter. She recognized them immediately. "You're here about that man?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "We are. Can you tell us everything you saw?" The waitress set down her rag and folded her arms. He ordered coffee and a burger, but the way he treated that little girl, it wasn't right. She looked scared, kept fidgeting with her bear. When she dropped it, he grabbed her arm hard. I wanted to call someone, but I didn't know for sure. Marcus's throat tightened. Claire spoke calmly. Did you hear him say anything? Where he might be headed? The waitress nodded. Yeah, he was on the phone at one point. Said he was heading to the cabin. There's an old hunting cabin out near Crooked Pines. Folks say it's abandoned, but some people still use it. Marcus's pulse quickened. Do you have an address? The waitress shook her head. No address, but it's past the second turnoff from the fire road. Claire tapped Marcus's arm. Let's go. As they rushed back to their cars, Marcus felt a cold, steady resolve settle over him. If Carson was holed up at that cabin, they had a chance to end this nightmare for good. No more kids lost. The road leading to Crooked Pines was narrow and rough, lined with darkened trees that seemed to close in around them. The headlights of Marcus's cruiser cut through the thick shadows, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as he sped forward. Claire's unmarked car followed close behind, her blue and red dash lights flickering faintly in the night. The waitress's directions had been vague, but Marcus's gut told him they were close. The fire road twisted ahead, its path illuminated by their high beams. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing with possibilities. Dispatch, this is Officer Reed, he said into the radio. Heading west on Fire Road 2 toward the Crooked Pines cabin. Suspect believed to be armed and dangerous. Possible hostage on site. Requesting backup. A crackle of static was followed by a calm reply. Copy that, Officer Reed. Units are en route. ETA 15 minutes. Claire's voice came over the radio next. We might not have 15 minutes, Marcus. I know, Marcus muttered. The forest around them felt alive, every rustling branch and distant snap of twigs amplifying the tension in his chest. Finally, as they rounded the second turnoff, a faint shape appeared through the trees, a single-story wooden cabin, its weathered frame sagging under the weight of years of neglect. A faint glow seeped through the windows. Marcus slowed to a stop 100 yards away, turning off the engine and the headlights. Claire parked beside him and stepped out, pulling her coat tighter as she approached. That's the place, Claire whispered, nodding toward the cabin. We go quiet, we go smart. Marcus nodded. We get the girl out first, no matter what. Claire's jaw tightened. Agreed. They moved through the underbrush silently, their flashlights off to avoid drawing attention. The cold air stung Marcus's face as they crept closer, staying low. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of movement coming from inside. Marcus's heart pounded as they reached the side window, crouching low beneath the frame. He risked a glance inside and felt his pulse spike. Carson was pacing near the back of the cabin, his dark hoodie pulled low over his face. His movements were erratic, restless. Near the bed, Lucy Harper sat with her knees pulled to her chest, the stuffed bear clutched in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus pulled back and met Claire's gaze. It's her. She's alive. Claire nodded. We need to catch him off guard. Marcus's mind worked quickly. You cover the back exit. I'll draw him to the front. Be careful, Claire said, her eyes narrowing with concern. Marcus exhaled slowly and moved toward the front door. His every step felt deliberate, his breathing controlled, despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. When he reached the porch, he positioned himself to the side of the door and called out, Matthew Carson, this is the police. Come out with your hands where I can see them. There was a beat of silence, followed by a loud crash from inside. Carson burst through the door, his hood falling back to reveal his sharp, gaunt features. In his right hand was a hunting knife, the blade catching the faint light. His eyes were wild as they locked onto Marcus. Stay back, Carson yelled, brandishing the knife. Marcus held his ground, his hands raised. Matthew, it's over. You don't have to do this. Lucy doesn't have to get hurt. She's scared of you, Carson shouted, his voice raw and desperate. "She's safer with me." Behind Carson, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement Lucy, shifting slightly, her eyes flickering toward the open back door. Claire was in position. Marcus's voice softened. "Matthew, look at her. Look how frightened she is. This isn't saving her, it's terrorizing her." Carson's grip on the knife tightened, his breathing shallow and uneven. Then, Claire's voice rang out from behind. "Drop it, Carson, now!" Carson whirled around, his knife raised. Claire's gun was leveled steadily at him, her stance unwavering. "Last chance," Claire warned. "Drop the weapon." Carson hesitated for a split second before he lunged toward the back door, knife in hand. A shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the night air. Carson's body jerked as he stumbled forward, the knife clattering to the floor. He crumpled to his knees, clutching his shoulder where Claire's bullet had struck. Marcus surged forward, pinning Carson to the ground as Claire moved in to secure the knife. "It's over," Marcus growled as he snapped the cuffs onto Carson's wrists. Carson let out a low, pained groan, but he didn't fight back. Claire's gaze shifted to the bed. "Lucy!" Marcus turned as Lucy darted forward, running straight into his arms. He caught her, lifting her up as she buried her face in his shoulder. "It's okay," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." Claire crouched beside them, her hand resting gently on Lucy's back. "It's over," she murmured. Within minutes, the backup units arrived, their headlights casting long shadows across the clearing. Paramedics rushed to Carson, who was still groaning on the ground, and secured him for transport. Officers moved to secure the scene. Marcus carried Lucy outside, the cold night air hitting them both as they stepped into the open. Claire stayed close, her protective gaze never wavering. Lucy's grip on Marcus didn't loosen as the paramedics approached. "Do I have to go with them?" she whispered. Marcus's throat tightened. "Just for a little bit so they can make sure you're okay. But I'll be right behind you." Lucy's small fingers clutched his sleeve. "Promise?" Marcus nodded. "Promise." Claire watched as Marcus placed Lucy gently into the ambulance, her face softening as she saw the way Lucy looked at him with trust, with relief. "You did good, Marcus," Claire said as the ambulance doors closed. Marcus exhaled, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "We both did." Claire gave him a small, tired smile. "One more monster off the streets." Marcus nodded, but his mind lingered on the bigger picture. "There's more out there," he said quietly. "More kids, more families. Carson and Miller weren't working alone." Claire's smile faded, replaced by resolve. "Then we keep going." Marcus stared at the dark forest beyond the clearing. The night felt endless, but there was hope now, a fragile, flickering light. He turned back to Claire, his jaw tightening. "We won't stop until we find them all." "Not one," Claire agreed. They stood side by side, watching the ambulance pull away, carrying Lucy toward safety. For the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself a breath of relief. The fight wasn't over, but for Lucy Harper, this nightmare had ended. The precinct was buzzing when Marcus and Claire arrived. Phones rang, officers moved with purpose, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. But all of it felt distant to Marcus as he stepped through the doors, still carrying the weight of the night's events. He paused at the reception desk, watching as an officer handed over Carson's file to be processed. Carson was in custody now, sedated and on his way to the hospital under guard. But Marcus knew that the arrest wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Claire tapped his arm, pulling him from his thoughts. "We need to see what else he's hiding," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Lucy's safe, but there's more to this." Marcus nodded and followed her down the hall to the observation room where John Miller was being held. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow from the one-way mirror. Miller sat at the metal table, his wrists still cuffed, His head was bowed, his messy hair hiding his face. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched from behind the glass. "He looks different now," he muttered. "The control's gone." Claire crossed her arms. "He doesn't have Carson to back him up anymore." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Let's see if he's ready to talk." They entered the room, the door clicking shut behind them. Miller didn't look up as they approached, but his hands fidgeted against the metal cuffs. Claire sat down across from him while Marcus remained standing, arms crossed. "Miller," Claire began, her tone calm but firm. "It's over. Carson's in custody. Lucy's safe, and we've got enough evidence to bury both of you. But we need answers. If you talk now, maybe we can make things easier for you." Miller didn't respond. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low but cutting. "Carson left you behind, didn't he? That was always the plan. He gets away, and you take the fall." Miller's head jerked up at that. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and gaunt. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw something break beneath that blank exterior betrayal. "He said we were helping them," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. "He told me they were better off with us." Claire leaned forward, softening her tone slightly. "Miller, there are other children out there, aren't there?" Miller's face twisted, his jaw tightening. "You don't get it. You think you're saving them, but you're sending them back to people who don't care." He stopped himself, taking a shaky breath. "Tell us where they are," Marcus said, his voice steady. "If you really care about those kids, tell us the truth." Miller's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might finally break. But instead, Miller shook his head slowly. "You're too late," he muttered. Claire's eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" Miller's lips pressed into a thin line, and he stared down at his hands. Marcus felt a cold dread settle over him. "We need to move fast," he said to Claire. Back in the squad room, Claire pulled up every file they had on Carson, Miller, and the properties linked to them. The information poured onto the screen a web of aliases, false addresses, and unexplained transactions. Claire scrolled through the details, her face tight with focus. "This is bigger than we thought." Marcus leaned over her shoulder. "What's that?" She pointed to a flagged line in one of the financial reports. "Look at this. Miller and Carson weren't just moving around on their own. There's a holding property under a different name, outside of state lines. It's been getting monthly transfers from an account registered to someone named Daniel Hawthorne." Marcus's brow furrowed. "We've never heard that name before." Claire's fingers flew across the keyboard. Moments later, a photo and file appeared. "Hawthorne's a businessman with no public record of criminal activity. But look at this, his company owns several warehouses in remote areas." Marcus's heart sank. If they were using those warehouses for anything like this— Claire didn't need to finish. The implications were clear. Marcus straightened, his resolve hardening. "We need to alert the task force." The conference room filled quickly with agents from multiple departments, local, state, and federal. A map of the area was projected onto the wall, with several points marked in red. Claire and Marcus stood at the front as the team reviewed the findings. Claire tapped the screen. "Based on financial records and travel patterns, these warehouses are potential locations tied to Hawthorne. Our primary suspect, Carson, was last traced to this property before he disappeared last month. We believe it's being used as a holding location." An agent raised his hand. "What do we know about Hawthorne himself?" Marcus answered, his tone measured but grim. "We know he stays in the shadows. Carson and Miller were foot soldiers, but Hawthorne might be the one pulling the strings." Claire met the room's collective gaze. "We're coordinating simultaneous raids. We're not just stopping one abduction, we're dismantling the entire operation." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the mission sinking in. Then the commanding officer stood and nodded. "Let's get it done." Marcus stepped into the hallway, exhaling slowly. Claire joined him, her expression resolute. You ready for this? She asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. We have to be. Claire gave a small nod and placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll bring them home. Marcus looked at her, his eyes unwavering. Every last one of them. As they walked toward the exit, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a soft light over the city. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were closer than ever to the truth and to justice. The engines roared to life as the convoy of police vehicles and task force units rolled out, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. Marcus sat in the driver's seat, the hum of the cruiser vibrating beneath him as he tightened his grip on the wheel. Beside him, Claire was focused, scrolling through the files on her tablet one last time, double-checking every detail. They were headed to a remote warehouse nearly 60 miles out, a place registered under one of Daniel Hawthorne's shell companies. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, the perfect location for someone who didn't want to be found. Backup's 5 minutes behind us, Claire said, breaking the silence. But if they're holding anyone there... We can't wait, Marcus finished. His voice was low but steady, though the tension in his chest coiled tighter with every passing mile. Claire glanced at him. You sure you're ready for this? Marcus didn't take his eyes off the road. I'm ready. He paused, his jaw tightening. I keep thinking about Lucy, how close we were to losing her. There are more kids out there, Claire. If we don't stop this now... Claire's voice softened. We will. Marcus nodded but didn't respond. The road stretched ahead, long and desolate. Each passing second felt heavier, like time itself was working against them. By the time they reached the final turnoff, the sun was rising, casting pale gold light over the trees. The warehouse loomed ahead, a cold, gray structure, surrounded by rusted fences and patches of dead grass. Marcus pulled the cruiser into the shadows of the tree line, cutting the engine. Claire parked beside him, stepping out quietly. They both slipped their weapons from their holsters and moved toward the edge of the lot. The place looked abandoned, but Marcus had learned not to trust appearances. Claire scanned the perimeter through her binoculars. 2 guards, she whispered. Front entrance and side door, both armed. Marcus nodded. We need to get closer. They crept through the underbrush, their steps slow and deliberate. The morning air was crisp, their breath forming small clouds as they moved. The guard at the front entrance shifted, scanning the tree-lined but seeing nothing. Claire tapped Marcus's arm. We'll split. I'll take the side door and cover you from there. Be careful, Marcus said, his voice low. Claire gave him a quick nod and disappeared around the side of the building. Marcus exhaled slowly, centering himself. He stepped forward, careful to stay low as he reached the base of the stairs leading up to the front entrance. The guard was leaning casually against the doorframe, his rifle hanging loose at his side. He yawned, distracted for a moment long enough for Marcus to make his move. With one swift motion, Marcus lunged forward, grabbing the rifle and wrenching it away. The guard let out a strangled shout, but Marcus slammed him against the wall, pinning him with a forearm to the chest. Quiet, Marcus hissed. The guard's eyes widened in panic as he struggled, but Marcus was stronger. In seconds, the man was subdued, zip-tied, and unconscious on the ground. Marcus pressed his radio. Front secure. Claire's voice came back. Sides clear too. I'm in position. Marcus turned the handle of the front door and pushed it open slowly. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint scent of oil. The warehouse floor stretched wide and open, cluttered with crates and discarded machinery. At the far end, there was a row of doors, offices, or rooms that had been converted for something else. Marcus's pulse quickened as he moved forward, his footsteps light but deliberate. He could hear Claire circling the far side, her movements steady and precise. A faint noise reached his ears, the sound of muffled voices. He raised his weapon and pressed himself against the wall. The voices grew louder as he approached the largest of the doors. He signaled to Claire as she appeared from the opposite side. She nodded, her gun at the ready. Marcus counted to 3 in his head, then kicked the door open. The scene inside hit him like a punch to the gut. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all around Lucy's age, were sitting on thin mattresses, their hands clutching small blankets. Their eyes widened in fear as the door burst open. In the corner of the room, a man in a dark jacket sprang to his feet, a gun in his hand. "Drop it!" Marcus shouted. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before firing a wild shot toward the ceiling. Marcus moved fast, charging forward before the man could aim again. They collided hard, the gun clattering to the floor as they wrestled. Claire moved in, grabbing the weapon and pulling the children back toward the door. "It's okay," she reassured them. "We're here to get you out." The man threw a wild punch, but Marcus blocked it and twisted his arm, forcing him to the ground. The man let out a pained yell as Marcus pinned him. "Game's over!" Marcus growled, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. The man thrashed weakly, but didn't resist further. Claire rushed back, her face tight with concern. "We need to move, now." Marcus nodded and turned to the children. "It's okay," he said gently, lowering his weapon. "We're the police. You're safe now." One of the boys, who couldn't have been older than 6, clung to Claire's arm, his small body trembling. The little girl wiped her tear-streaked face and looked up at Marcus with wide, scared eyes. Marcus knelt beside her, his voice soft. "What's your name?" "Emma," she whispered. Marcus nodded. "Emma, we're going to take you home." She nodded slowly, her small fingers gripping the edge of his jacket. By the time the backup units arrived, the suspects had been secured, and the children were being led out to waiting ambulances. The once silent warehouse was now filled with the hum of radios, the chatter of officers, and the distant roar of approaching helicopters. Claire stood beside Marcus as they watched the ambulances drive away, taking the children to safety. "We did it," Claire murmured. Marcus exhaled, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. "Yeah, we did." But as he watched the road disappear into the horizon, he knew there was still more work to be done. Claire rested a hand on his shoulder. "We brought them back, Marcus. That's what matters." Marcus nodded slowly, one step at a time. Claire's eyes softened. "You made a difference tonight." Marcus looked out at the rising sun, the first light spilling over the treetops. For the first time in what felt like days, he felt hope. The shadows of the past still loomed, but for those children and for Lucy, there was a brighter future ahead. The precinct was quieter than usual when Marcus and Claire returned. The steady hum of computers and the occasional clatter of keyboards were the only sounds as officers processed the aftermath of the raid. But the silence was heavy, charged with the weight of everything they had uncovered. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the case files spread out in front of him, the photos of the children they had rescued, the reports detailing the arrests of Carson and Miller, and the search warrants for Daniel Hawthorne's properties. Every paper told a grim story, but there was still a missing piece, a name, a motive, a final thread to tie it all together. Claire set 2 cups of coffee on the desk and slid into the chair across from him. "You should drink something," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Marcus reached for the cup, though his hands still felt tense. "Thanks." Claire took a sip before speaking. "We did everything we could, Marcus. 3 kids are safe because of that raid, and Lucy's home with her family. That's a win." Marcus nodded slowly, but his eyes remained on the folder. "It's a win, but it's not over. We still don't know how Hawthorne fits into this. Miller and Carson might be in custody, but if they were just following orders..." Claire's brow furrowed. "Hawthorne's been careful, kept his name clean, used middlemen for everything. But we'll find him." She leaned forward. "We have to." Marcus exhaled and opened Lucy's case file again. He flipped through the pages until he reached a copy of the financial transaction report Claire had uncovered. His eyes traced the lines of payments that had been funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ledger. These payments, Hawthorne's been moving money consistently every few weeks, but there's something strange. The amounts aren't random. They're too consistent. Like someone's on a schedule. Claire pulled her chair closer. It looks like payroll. Regular payments to keep people quiet. Marcus's jaw tightened. Or to fund more abductions. Claire's phone buzzed on the desk, and she glanced at the screen. Her eyes sharpened. It's from Financial Crimes. They traced one of Hawthorne's payments to a new address. Marcus's pulse quickened. Where? Claire read the message aloud. An old office building on the outskirts of Ridgefield. It's registered under a different company name, but it's tied to the same accounts. Marcus stood, grabbing his coat. That's where we'll find him. Claire followed, already alerting dispatch. If Hawthorne's there, he's not walking out of this free. The drive to Ridgefield was tense, but focused. Claire handled the radio calls, coordinating backup and informing the FBI task force, while Marcus kept his eyes on the road. The office building loomed ahead, a long concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence. They parked a block away and approached on foot, staying low as they surveyed the area. The lot was empty except for a single black SUV parked near the entrance. Looks like someone's home, Claire muttered. Marcus nodded and signaled for Claire to circle left while he moved toward the front. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Marcus stepped inside, his gun raised. The air inside was stale, the flickering fluorescent lights casting uneven shadows across the room. Rows of empty cubicles lined the floor, but toward the back, Marcus spotted a faint glow from an office window. He moved quietly, listening. A low voice drifted through the door, calm, controlled. Marcus paused and signaled to Claire, who joined him silently. They could make out the words now. "You think you've won," the voice said. "But you're only seeing the surface." Marcus pushed the door open, gun raised. "Daniel Hawthorne, don't move." The man standing at the desk was tall and composed, wearing a tailored suit. He didn't flinch at the sight of them. Instead, he raised his hands slowly, a faint smirk on his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Hawthorne said smoothly. Claire stepped in behind Marcus, her gun steady. "Hands where we can see them, now." Hawthorne complied, his movements calm, almost rehearsed. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're done, Hawthorne. We have enough evidence to charge you with conspiracy, abduction, and trafficking." Hawthorne's smile didn't fade. "You think you've dismantled the operation, but you're mistaken. I'm just a small part of a much larger machine." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then start talking." Hawthorne's eyes gleamed. "If you knew what I knew, you'd be terrified." Marcus took a step forward. "The only thing that terrifies me is how many people like you get away with destroying lives." He pulled out the handcuffs. "Not this time." As Marcus cuffed him, Hawthorne's smirk finally faltered. "You can arrest me, but you won't stop all of it." Claire's voice was cold. "We'll see about that." Hawthorne was processed at the precinct within the hour, his smug demeanor replaced by something colder, an acknowledgement that his power had slipped. Marcus and Claire watched from behind the glass as the federal agents prepared to take Hawthorne into federal custody. Claire broke the silence. "He's right about one thing. This network is bigger than we thought." Marcus nodded. "But he underestimated us. We stopped him, and we'll keep stopping the others until there's nothing left of this operation." Claire's gaze softened. "Lucy gets to go to school tomorrow. Emma and those boys get to go home. That's because of you." Marcus looked at her, his expression quiet but resolute. "Because of us." Later that night, Marcus drove to a small park near his neighborhood, one he often visited when he needed to clear his mind. The playground was empty, except for one family, a woman with dark hair and a bright smile, pushing her daughter on the swings. Marcus smiled faintly as he recognized them. Lucy Harper's laughter rang through the air as her mother called out, "Higher!" Lucy caught sight of Marcus and waved excitedly. He raised his hand in return, feeling a wave of calm wash over him. Claire's voice echoed in his mind. We brought them back. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. The shadows might still be out there, but tonight, there was light. The courtroom was packed, a low hum of tension hanging in the air. Reporters lined the back row, their pens poised, their cameras ready to capture every detail of what was about to unfold. Family members of the victims filled the seats, their faces etched with worry and hope. Marcus sat near the front, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't here to celebrate or bask in recognition. He was here for justice. Claire sat beside him, her expression calm but alert, a quiet strength radiating from her presence. At the defendant's table, Daniel Hawthorne sat in a pressed suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands folded. But the smugness he had worn so confidently before was gone. His eyes were dark, hollow. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The jury filed in, their faces solemn as they took their seats. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his heart steady but tense. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hand. He cleared his throat before reading aloud. In the case of Daniel Hawthorne, we find the defendant guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, kidnapping, and human trafficking. A collective exhale filled the room, followed by hushed murmurs. A woman in the second row began to cry softly. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of the moment settle in his chest. When he opened them again, he saw Lucy Harper's parents, Claire and Michael, holding each other tightly, their tears a mixture of relief and gratitude. Hawthorne's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw something in his eyes: fear. The walls had closed in, and there was no escape. The judge's gavel struck the podium. The defendant is sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sunlight outside the courthouse was warm, the first hints of spring in the air. As Marcus and Claire stepped down the marble steps, reporters swarmed with questions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. Detective Reed, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you believe the full network has been dismantled? Marcus held up a hand, keeping his expression calm. We're proud of the work we've done. Today is about the victims, the children who were taken, and their families who never gave up hope. Our work isn't done, but today, justice was served. Claire nodded in agreement before leading Marcus away from the crowd. You handled that well, Claire said as they reached their cars. Marcus shrugged. It's not about the headlines. Claire gave him a knowing smile. No, it's about the kids. Marcus exhaled. Yeah, and they're safe now. That evening, Marcus drove to the park again. The same one where he had seen Lucy before. He wasn't sure what drew him there, but something about the laughter of children reminded him why he did what he did. He sat on the bench near the swings, watching as families enjoyed the early evening. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the sound of kids calling to each other as they played. Officer Reed! The familiar voice made him turn. Lucy Harper was running toward him, her curly hair bouncing as she ran. Her mother, Claire Harper, followed behind, smiling warmly. Lucy reached him and threw her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Hi, Marcus smiled, hugging her back. Hey, Lucy, how are you? I'm good, she said brightly. Mommy says I get to start school next week. That's great news, Marcus replied. Claire Harper reached the bench, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. We wanted to say thank you, she said softly. Again. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Marcus shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Just seeing Lucy safe and happy, that's more than enough. Lucy grinned and held up her stuffed bear. I still have her too. Marcus laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Claire Harper's eyes glistened. You're a good man, Marcus. Don't ever doubt that. Marcus nodded, feeling the warmth of her words settle deep inside. Thank you. Later that night, as Marcus sat in his quiet apartment, He reflected on everything that had happened, the darkness they had confronted, the children they had saved, and the justice they had fought for. The case had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also reminded him of something important. Even in the darkest places, there was light. Claire had once said that resilience wasn't about never feeling fear, it was about choosing to keep going, despite it. Marcus understood that, more than ever now. The next morning, he was back on patrol, the city streets waking up under the glow of the sunrise. The hum of the engine was steady beneath him, familiar and grounding. His eyes stayed sharp, scanning the roads, the sidewalks, every corner. He knew better than anyone how quickly life could change, how a simple stop could turn into a race against time. But he also knew that small acts of courage mattered. A hunch, a moment of hesitation, a choice to dig deeper, it all made a difference. As he drove past the park, Marcus saw Lucy's family setting up a picnic. Lucy waved at him from the swings, her smile wide and bright. Marcus waved back, a small but genuine smile forming on his face. The road ahead was long, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't afraid to travel it. Because sometimes, even the smallest voice crying "help me" could lead to a story of resilience, hope, and healing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Officer Marcus Reed's journey had come full circle. From a routine traffic stop to a race against time, every step had been driven by his unshakable commitment to do what was right. The children he rescued would grow up knowing that courage, resilience, and kindness could make the world a safer place. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found. Every small act of kindness can lead to a better tomorrow. If you are moved by this story and believe in the power of hope and resilience, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful content that inspires and uplifts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how everyday heroes make a difference, one life at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, no act of courage is ever too small.